Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's LinkedIn Live. I have a very special guest today. I am so excited to be speaking with Anne Clark Wolff, who is the founder and CEO of Independence Point Advisors, who we'll probably refer to as IPA during the next 30 minutes or so. This is the first female-owned investment bank and C-suite advisory on Wall Street. So you can see part of the reason for my excitement. Anne founded IPA in November of 2021 after spending 30 years in financial services, many of the big name Wall Street firms on her resume. But she now has a mission to diversify Wall Street and change the face of corporate America. And I think beyond that, as we'll hear, it's not just about diversification, it's about the results that diversification will bring. So Anne, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thank you for having me. It's really an honor.
Terrific. So maybe you could just give us a little background about the problem you set out to solve, sort of why and how did you set out to modernize this industry?
So, it's a great question. I started my career in investment banking at Salomon Brothers in 1989. And believe it or not, there were more women in my class at Salomon in 1989 and more women managing directors in 1989 than there were in 2020. And when I looked back at the end of my career and I thought about what was the legacy I wanted to leave on Wall Street, where did I still see an opportunity for people to frankly enjoy the incredible career that I enjoyed, it just gnawed at me that I thought clients were missing a really important different set of voices and advice at the table when they're frankly confronting some of the most complex challenges that they've ever come across. So, the combination both of I couldn't leave Wall with less gender diversity in particular, but diversity of all kinds. And also I saw that clients were really, I think, ready to embrace that they needed to have people who looked like their employees and their stakeholders giving them the best advice.
Wow. Yeah, I'm an engineer by degree and was certainly the first and only woman in many of my classes at a traditional all-male school. And while that's not the case anymore, certainly when I work with clients, I won't be the only woman in the room, but I may be the only woman with a technical background in the room. And it astounds me that here we are in A, the 21st century, and B, 2022, and that's still going on.
And by the way, women now represent 57% of college students. So women have eclipsed men for a number of years in academics, and women are representing 57% of the workforce. So the question is, what do we all have to do to pull that talent through and really profile it in helping solve so many of the world's biggest problems?
Yes, pull it through and retain it once we pulled it through, right? All in the service of cognitive diversity, which I think we can talk about in a bit. So who and how have you hired to create this broadly diverse organization?
So I set out first and foremost to hire exceptional talent. Clients may be very sympathetic and responsive to the notion of diversity. But at the end of the day, if you think you need a brain surgeon, you're going to hire the best brain surgeon. So first and foremost, I wanted to find exceptional talent. Now, the beauty with that is that to be diverse on Wall Street and to survive and advance in your career, in my opinion, you had to be exceptional. So when I went out to solve that simultaneous equation of exceptional and coincidentally diverse, I was blown away candidly by how many people were really ready to both embrace doing something different. And part of my approach, as I talked to probably over 200 diverse leaders on Wall Street, and the angle I took was, are you ready for three things? Would you like a career with more aperture? In many cases, people on Wall Street have been in a pretty narrow swim lane doing the same thing, certainly for the past 10 years. And I think a number of people are ready to spread their wings and see a broader element of how they can advise clients. I think the second element that I appealed to was really a notion of collaboration.
Mm.
How do you actually bring different people together and let them see the excitement of leveraging each other? And while that sounds like it would be obvious, I think, again, collaboration and inclusion are two really tough words when you think about the conventional large firms. The third element was transparency. This is an industry that attracts people who are willing to work really hard, but who
Mhm.
also want to enjoy the benefits of that hard work. And I think the compensation arrangement in many of the large firms had gotten to a point where it got harder and harder to see how an individual's own productivity could really lead to kind of the personal success on the back end. And so we have a pretty transparent model, and we want that to be something that, again, encourages people who love providing clients with advice and, frankly, want to bet on themselves a little bit more.
Yeah. Wow, it sounds like all the ingredients for great employee engagement and retention, right? I mean,
But I would add, and I shouldn't have neglected this, geographic flexibility. Our
mm,
team is in Bend, Oregon, Austin, Texas, Philadelphia, Atlanta, you know, all across the country, because I think while I am very sympathetic to, I would love to have a team that all sat in the same office as we used to in the old days. I think it's the old days. And I think, again, in the war for talent, you need to meet talent where they are, and you need to figure out a model that's going to recognize, I think, getting people back into a Midtown Manhattan office 5 days a week, especially for working mothers and many candidates, is going to be very tricky.
yeah, agreed. So, how are you managing that? I do a fair amount of work with teams in the service of hyper growth, high performance, and it's easier always to have that dynamic in person because you have this great chance to create social capital with each other. It is harder, although by no means impossible, to do it when you are a remote or even a hybrid team. So, how are you managing those dynamics within your new team?
It's hard. Like, I'm not going to lie. I think that, and this is the reason I think so many companies are struggling with
Mm,
this. In the services industry, and you would probably agree, apprenticeship is a big part of the model. And so the way that we're tackling it is we bring everybody together at least once a quarter. So I'll have everybody in New York again next week, which will be, 2 days of a combination presentations, content, but just time to collaborate as well. We use platforms like Teams and others. We get together every Monday and Wednesday, a mix
mm,
of kind of going through one very client focused call, one call that's a little bit more thematic and training oriented.
mhm.
And, we're having to kind of adapt to a lot of the technology. So in some ways, it's hard to keep track of where are you in a Teams chat at the moment? Where are you using old fashioned email? But I
Mm.
think, again, this is part of trying to modernize investment banking. I jokingly say the last innovation I can think of in investment banking was Excel in 1990. So the notion that we still have these poor young people working 20 hours a day, producing a 100-page pitch book that the client probably isn't really going to look at, or they're not going to look at more than a few pages. I just keep having to remind myself that while it's uncomfortable trying to drive change, this is an exciting moment to try to
Mm,
modernize this industry. And I
yeah,
think that this notion of a remote workforce is going to be really, really critical to that.
yeah. Yeah, definitely an inflection point. Although it's not a moment in time, it's a period for when things are happening. Part of my pandemic lockdown reading was The House of Morgan, and which
Yeah.
is a tome, as you probably
Sure.
know. And and you're right, there hasn't been a lot of innovation in the field until very, very recently. And we just have this great opportunity now. So kudos to you for taking great
We
advantage of that.
And part of how we've tried to manifest that is that half of our team are experts in ESG,
Mm,
cybersecurity, public policy, topics that human capital, all topics that every single company and board I know are grappling with. And interestingly, in my view, they had not been brought close enough to investment banking advice.
mm,
So the example I always give is that there are many brilliant ESG consultants who are experts at ESG, but often I think that the advice they're giving a client, I think tends to fall a little bit flat with the CEO who's trying to navigate, I've got to grow the top line, I've got to be compliant with the SEC, I have to make sure that I don't have challenges with my employees who think that I'm not being credible or legitimate. And so our hope was that those 3 or 4 very modern topics would give us a way to complement almost any other advisor that a company would want to use. Because I don't think that we're not going to outsmart or out resource Morgan Stanley's XYZ group or Goldman
Right.
Sachs's ABC group. But so I think, most investment banks are very linear around industry depth, and our
Hmm.
hope is that by adding these content elements, there's really a great way to make 1 + 1 to equal 3.
Yeah, great point. I mean, the CEO and hopefully the rest of the team are focused on how do we take these new requirements like ESG and use them in a way that expands, supports, enhances our business and the business of our clients, right? As opposed to being some standalone element. So,
And the challenge with that, Karen, is that what we find is everything you've said is true, but if you're a high growth company, you haven't really thought about it until the moment that you're having to do it under a deadline.
mm,
And so part of one of our competitive advantages is we want to work with companies 18 to 24 months before an exit,
mhm,
help them think about those goals, set it up, measure it, and document it. So then when that strategic event does happen, you're not scrambling at the printer the night before you're filing your S1 to say, okay, what can we take off the shelf that will work on ESG? And
yeah,
again, I think that this is a moment and maybe one of the few silver linings of the pause in the equity market is, do we
mm,
have a chance now to catch up and help these companies be prepared to re-enter what will be a very different market?
yes, agreed. I was just having conversations this morning about that with a client that the changes that have occurred over just the past few months in terms of the ability, the probability, the way that an exit might occur. So super, super smart. So what have your results been so far? I know you're only like 6, 7 months old now as an organization. And so what's the reception been and what kind of results have you seen?
I have to say it's incredibly humbling and gratifying. We cover from late stage growth companies all the way to the largest companies in the world. And when I present at meetings or conferences, people are cheering, which is kind of like I almost sit back like, wow, which it's encouraging that I think people would universally acknowledge they have not seen a great choice for high content advice with diverse representation. I think that then we've been very fortunate that the first few transactions we've been invited into have really played very similar to some of the themes I've mentioned. We're working with a female founder who's selling her company, and it was a perfect fit to really leverage the alliance that we've got with Lazard Frere,
Hmm.
where again, this founder has the benefit of both a very talented team at IPA, an industry specific team at Lazard, and she gets the benefit of both. We're working on some capital raises for companies that have a very strong ESG orientation. I think these
Mm,
founders feel very aligned in what we're trying to do. And I think as they're scaling their growth, we're stepping into helping them close out some of those funding rounds, which again were a little bit more straightforward prior to 2 months ago, but I think
yes.
we're still really compelling because of the innovation that's happening in that space. And the final piece is we were incredibly fortunate that we were approved by FINRA for our broker dealer,
Mm,
which is a woman owned broker dealer, about 3 weeks ago. And it
congrats.
was incredibly humbling that we were included in a very large bond deal with PayPal our first day of our FINRA approval. And it was just so heartwarming that the client who'd actually worked for me in a prior life said he felt so strongly that he knew his career was influenced by having the right support and people who were proponents of his. And it was his way to return that favor in a way. So we're excited to start helping as many clients as possible in capital raising, whether it's private or whether it's investment grade bonds or hopefully a reopening of the IPO market as we get into the fall.
Yeah. Well, congratulations on all of that. And I think there's no better testament than having a former client or a former colleague trust you enough, right, to work with you in terms of their clients early on. So high fives. It's just wonderful news.
Fingers crossed. I think that the moment that I still think about and that keeps me up at night is I'm hopeful that we're closer to the moment where a big company CEO is about to announce a transaction and says, I could add IPA and I could pick up real expertise that I need in ESG, data privacy, cybersecurity. I could pick up this exceptional team and I can have them partner with another bank of my choice. And that combination will lead me to make a better decision and have a more successful deal. The moment that that happens, and I'm sitting with you or I'm sitting with CNBC talking about the power of that combination, that to me is the flywheel moment where we can really catalyze change. And I'm excited that, hopefully one of the opportunities in a challenging equity market will be a pivot to M&A. I do think that once companies get their feet underneath this market and this world, I think that there will be some real opportunities to take advantage of that.
Yes. Yeah, absolutely. It has to be pulled from the client side. It's wonderful to offer it, but there has to be a pull from it. And my hope is that we have an avalanche headed our way in terms of pull, because the customer base, not just like sort of our clients, but the end customer base will demand it, that companies are paying attention.
I debated for a long time before I formed the company, is ESG a bull market trend or is this here forever? And we're going to test that candidly now. There are a few cynics who look at, especially given the energy stock performance, given what's going on in the world. Yeah. But I think that the funds flow, and more importantly, the sentiment of the next generation of founders and investors leads me to believe that companies just perform better when they're sensitive to these issues. This is not a either or where you happen to be a great ESG company and you have to sacrifice performance. And I think that's a key part of the advice we give companies is this is actually about just better financial performance. It's frustrating to them because there are a lot of curveballs that they'll have to navigate around the reporting and a number of the changes. But I'm hopeful we don't lose the momentum that we've already started to see of why ESG is good for business.
Yeah, agreed. I've spoken recently with leaders from Genpact and SAP, both of whom this is just a core part of how they do business, and they are effusive about the results that they've seen once they've taken this on. So again, hopefully more than just a bull market. Nice to have. So I'd like to talk about you for a minute, if that's all right. In addition to working in high performance teams, I also, as a key component of that, spend a lot of time on leadership. So I know you were named as the most powerful woman, one of the most powerful women in banking by American Banker. Was there a piece of advice that you have for women who lead in an industry dominated by men, or, I would say in general, advice for people who are a minority in their industry?
I always cringe when I hear that term, and I cynically think of us as the endangered species group. When we show up at this dinner, we're a bunch of unicorns. But I would point out that I've always found in my 32 years across 3 very large institutions that women and diverse leaders lead differently. And I think they lead in a really accretive way that can and should complement the traditional leadership structure. And I say that because I think we tend to lead with empathy and humility and humanity, which I think the market has pivoted to. I think you can't manage a modern workforce if the people who you're leading don't ultimately feel that you do represent them as more than just the person who's dropping money to the bottom line of that institution. I'd say the second element that I've learned is in my 30s, if I saw something that was complicated, I probably had the classic imposter syndrome of, oh, I was a liberal arts major. I wasn't a Wharton finance person. And it's just me who doesn't understand it.
Mm.
Now in my 50s, I know if I don't understand it, I call it out immediately and say something is more complicated than it needs to be. And what is that telling us? And I think that bravery to speak up and bring the different perspectives you have to each of these problems is one of the real opportunities in being surrounded by a different group of people. There's an incredible academic piece prepared by a phenomenal leader named Afra Afsharapour, who is one of the deans at UC Davis Law School. And she's looked at the lack of women M&A lawyers, women in corporate development, and women bankers. Mm. And what I loved about her work was that she basically provided the academic rigor to show groupthink is a really bad thing.
Exactly.
We all need to be challenged, and being challenged is uncomfortable. It's harder to manage a diverse group. It's way harder. Yeah. But if you don't figure out how to bring each of those voices into the equation, you're leaving something behind that would make us better. And so that's my hope, is that IPA can be a proof point that bringing those different voices in and celebrating different voices will prove to be accretive and break the cycle that we've been in of just, there's not only one answer all the time anymore.
Yeah, agreed. You know, one of the examples that I'll often use around that is just that you have fewer blind spots, right? It's wonderful that, you know, we have so many smart people in the world and in this industry who can solve problems. But if you have a blind spot, you don't know it because you don't know it. And when you have a diverse group, cognitively diverse group, you have fewer blind spots. It's just the way it is. And that in and of itself, never mind all the other ideas that can be generated, makes this well worth doing. Yeah, so, you know, you have to create an environment where these things are possible, where people feel safe to disagree and to bring up their diverse opinions. So I'm curious, do you have leadership principles or tenets that you have developed over the years?
I do, but candidly, I'm having to challenge them as well, because it is a very different, it's very different managing a team that is 80% diverse and that has a lot of remote elements. So, you know, I'm a disciple in many ways of Jamie Dimon on the power of business reviews, measuring what you want to change. How do you really drive that performance? And that's something that I'm just starting to try to figure out. What is the IPA version of that and what should that look like? You know, I think it's challenging as a founder and CEO. What's fundamentally different than managing within large organizations is people look to you to lead and not do. And so I'm going to learn to not micromanage a little bit. I'm a little bit of a control freak. And again, I like a lot of information, and I find that the more people feed me information, the less I will get in their way. Yeah. But I think, again, that's also more challenging in a remote environment because you're not bumping into somebody on the way to refill your coffee cup where you're getting a lot of those updates along the way. So trying to think about what's the modern way of being current, but giving your team the room to really flourish is definitely more challenging than I think it's ever been. But I think that the kind of the core notion of if you pick great people and you inspire them that what you're doing has the potential to change the world, and then figure out how to make sure you measure along the way that we're getting the client feedback loop that says, yes, this works, or candidly accept the fact. One of the people on my team said, let's have everybody bring next week the ideas for the trash bin. What did we try to do? And what did we just say, you know what, that dog don't hunt, but we tried it and we move on. And I love that idea of just make it okay to acknowledge that we will try things and realize that didn't work. And then we pivot and use our creativity in different directions. So
Yeah.
I think that all of this is changing. I don't think that my old playbook or anybody's old playbook is going to be the same as we come into this new world order.
Yeah. Well said. I think creating this environment, this culture in the organization where it's not only okay to talk about your failure, it is good to talk about your failure because it's in the service of making the team better and as well as your individual learning. And that when you have an organization that lives by that and not only encourages it, but celebrates it, um, in addition to celebrating our wins, of course, that is a formula for success. It's great.
And how do we figure out, I'm still, and I would love your advice and others, I'm still learning on how do you create the feedback loop for those who are not comfortable
Mhm.
staying in a big group. I'm a professional extrovert. Having grown up at Solomon, I want people to challenge me to my face. I start every meeting with someone who works with me. Tell me why I'm wrong. Tell me
Mm.
your view. But even when you say that, it's still unrealistic to think that that's going to work for everybody. And so, I've set up a Google document of just where I want people to go in and log things they want us to stop doing, start doing, change.
Yeah.
But none of these are perfect. And so I'm always looking for how do you really pull out this wisdom in a way that meets people where they are and where they're most comfortable.
Yeah. Well, I would give you just two things, which you may have tried. One is people just have to trust that it's going to be all right because they may have had experiences in the past where it wasn't,
Yeah.
where they did take a risk and they spoke and it didn't go well. So that can be hard to come back from until you develop this trust. And then secondly, in meetings, we'll often, break people into small groups and let the group report out their questions
I
or
like
their concerns. And that gives the individual a little cover. So it's not so much that I'm asking the dumb question or I'm disagreeing. It's my group that's doing that. And that can be also a way to build momentum. So
that.
maybe that'll help.
Yeah, I love that. I mean, I'll tell you, one of the challenges on Wall Street, having led 1,000-person teams in these
Yeah.
big firms, is I observed one of two things over and over again. Either diverse candidates were silent because they had been raised, frankly, with fear
Yeah.
of lifting their head up and speaking their mind. Or the second phenomenon, which happened more than I would like to say for women, was that women would be told they were too rough around the edges. They were too direct. They were too this. They were too that. And what was sad about that was rather than the male leader saying, hey, I've got the benefit of these very different personalities on my team, it became, how can I force her
Mm.
into that same package and box as the 9 men on the team? And so, it got tiresome giving people performance reviews that were all basically about things that we would never want them to have to change.
Mm. Yeah. Good point. And thank you for bringing that up because it still exists, of course, in pockets
Unfortunately.
today. Yeah. So, Anne, my final question for you, the tagline for my business is up and to the right, because that is the spot on the 2x2 matrix where we always want to be. And I'm wondering, I mean, you've shared with us what that moment would be for IPA, right? But for yourself, was there a moment in your career, a seminal moment when you knew that you were moving in the right direction?
Well, I would say that, it's funny. I just had my daughter's 21 and one of her friends is just starting her career at one of the big banks. And she was talking about what an imposter she felt like. And I said, honey, I feel like I have imposter syndrome 4 hours every day of every week. And I've been doing this a really long time.
Yeah.
So I think there are very few people who live comfortably in that notion that you describe of when that moment was.
Mm.
But I would describe that when I pivoted to leading a very large group of people, and when I went into a role at JP Morgan that I think was 800 people worldwide, you realize you have to lead differently, and you could actually see in an audience when your points really resonate and when you inspire. And for me, when I can see that people are inspired and that it's going to allow them to bring their authentic self to work and that they achieve things that they never knew were possible. That's my upper right moment. And so I'm hopeful that in the case of IPA, of course I want us to be enormously financially successful. Of course I want to have a million really happy clients. But I think that those happy clients are going to drive demand for this future diverse advisor, that I would love that to be the legacy, that because the clients had such a great experience, it creates the demand and the pull through that hasn't happened so far. And that may be in the land of crazy ambition, but to me, it's certainly worth the noble effort. And I think that, again, companies have complicated enough problems that if we can help them in a valuable way, I think it will lead to pulling through exactly this missing component of talent that right now, unfortunately, is not very well represented on Wall Street.
Yeah. Well, what a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much, both for sharing your vision and yourself. I really appreciated our conversation and wish you all the best in the future.
Thank you for the opportunity, and thanks for teaching me. I love learning from the best like you, inspired by the work you're doing.
All right. Thank you, Anne. Take good care.